Is church attendance essential? You know, when I think of this question, it reminds me of the old country song by Don Williams. I don't remember the title of the song, but in it there's a line that goes, "I don't believe that heaven waits for only those who congregate." And so that seems to be the prevailing attitude among many, that church attendance is just really not essential. It's not all that important. But if you were to go back to the first century and go back to that early church and ask them if assembling together, attending worship services was essential to their lives. Well, let's look at some examples in the book of Acts. Over in Acts chapter 1, beginning there in verse 12, the apostles, they have just returned from the Mount of Olives where Jesus has ascended up to heaven, back to heaven. And it says there, then they returned unto Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is from Jerusalem a Sabbath day's journey. And notice it says, when they were come in, they went up into an upper room where abode Peter and James and John and Andrew, Philip and Thomas and Bartholomew and Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus and Simon Zelotes and Judas the brother of James. These all continued with one accord in prayer and supplication with the women Mary and the mother of Jesus, and with his brethren. And in those days Peter stood up in the midst of the disciples and said, the number of names together were about 120. And so we see they return from the Mount of Olives. They gather together with all of the Christians, about 120 disciples. And so we see, was that essential to them? I think it was. As we go on in verse chapter 2 and verse 42, after the church is established, it says, and they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, and in breaking of bread, and in prayers, and fear came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done by the apostles, and all that believed were together, and had all things common. And so they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, the doctrine the apostles had received from Christ by inspiration. And so they continued to follow and keep the commandments of God. Notice that they were involved in the breaking of bread. This is not a reference to a common meal, which they certainly did those as well, but this is particularly in reference to the Lord's Supper. And so they gathered together so they could have that communion together and take the Lord's Supper. Also, they were involved in praying together. You know, prayer and the Lord's Supper, these are acts of worship. And so they did them together. All that believed were together. And then when we look in Acts chapter 4, in verse 21, the apostles in particular are commanded not to preach in the name of Jesus anymore. And so that's in verse 21. And then in verse 23, these Jewish leaders let them go. And it says, and they went to their own company and reported all that the chief priests and elders had said unto them. And when they had heard that, they lifted up their voice to God with one accord. Here they come together and they pray with one voice, with one accord. Verse 31, it finishes up and says, and when they had prayed, the place was shaken where they were assembled together. And so you ask them, brethren, was it important for them to assemble together? Was it essential for them? I think they would answer absolutely yes. And this is again a time of distress. Another time of distress is found in Acts chapter 12. Remember, the Apostle James has been taken and brutally killed, murdered by the edge of the sword by King Herod. And then Peter is also taken into custody in verse 5. And so Peter's arrested, and in verses 6 through 11, Peter is delivered miraculously from that prison by the angel that leads him out. He comes out of the prison, he wakes up and realizes it wasn't a dream, that he's really free. And where does he go? He goes to the house of John Mark, to the mother of John Mark, actually, where it says in verse 12 that, and Peter knocked, and when he had considered the thing, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. And so in this time of distress, was it important for those brethren there was it essential for them really to be gathered together? And I think they would answer yes, absolutely. In Acts chapter 14, verse 27, we read about when Paul has returned from his first missionary journey. He assembles there with the saints at Antioch, and there he gives them a report of all that he had done on his mission trips, or his mission trip to that point. In Acts chapter 20, verses 7 and 8, we see this, and upon the first day of the week, notice what day they assembled. Upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, again, that's a reference, the purpose of taking the Lord's Supper. Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow, and they continued in his speech until midnight. And there were many lights in the upper chamber where they were gathered together. And so we see the church there, again, is gathered together. And so it was very common on the first day of the week, it was essential that the saints, following the apostles' doctrine, would assemble together on the first day of the week. You know, we look over in the book of 1 Corinthians and in chapter 11. Now, Paul is really addressing a lot of problems in their assemblies, but I want you to notice in verse 17, 18, 20, 33, and 34 of 1 Corinthians 11, he is addressing the things they were doing in their assemblies that were wrong. But the fact remains they were assembling. We see it in 1 Corinthians 14, verse 26, misusing spiritual gifts in their assemblies. We see it in 14, verse 23 as well. And then 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1 and 2, they're told upon the first day of the week that every one of you lay by him in store. Why were they to make this gathering on the first day of the week? Because they were already going to be assembled there. And so we see, from example, the early church assembled for worship services together upon the first day of the week. And then look over in the book of Hebrews. You know, Hebrews is written to Christians who were of a Jewish origin living around Judea, Jerusalem. They are persecuted. They are outcasts from society. And notice what it says there. And let us consider one another to provoke unto love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, so much the more as you see the day approaching. And so he says, consider one another. Think about one another. Have one another in your thoughts. And to provoke, generally, the word translated provoke means to sharpen or a sharpening. And generally it's used in a negative sense. You provoke someone to anger. But here it's used positively to provoke them unto good works. We provoke one another. And we consider one another. And we encourage one another to do what's right. And so if we stop assembling together, we're not together, how can we encourage and provoke one another unto love and to good works? And so we are to exhort one another. And so there's a whole lot more that could be said about the essentiality of worshiping and assembling with the saints to worship. You know, we live in an era where folks have, in many places, have replaced the assembling of themselves together with, sitting in front of a computer or in front of a phone and watching worship services, but they miss out on so much. They cannot truly be involved in the work of the church or in the worship assembly if they're not present there. Is church attendance essential? I believe absolutely. Thank you.